Okay, so this is topic 8. We're going to be talking about business impact analysis and business continuity planning. Right. Some of the backgrounds around this: there's a NIST document, NIST Special Publication 834, focused really on contingency planning for federal information systems. So it's more of a federal focus, but can be applied for other situations as well. And also, there's a couple of videos in here around dealing with business impact analysis, comparisons of business continuity to disaster recovery, and concepts around developing how do you develop a disaster recovery and continuity plans. So the basic concept, there's really two concepts that get, when we talk around continuity planning. One is what we call the business continuity plan. The other is what we call a disaster recovery plan. All right, so there's a difference between the two. Business continuity is really designed to mitigate the impact of a disaster when and is focused on business operations. So what you want to do is you want to manage and maintain your critical business operations and really establish a plan for how you're going to identify what are the what has to be recovered and the sequence in which it needs to be recovered. All right. Disaster recovery plans is actually more of is going to be a much more technically focused um, plan. So the idea is, its objective is to define what is going to take to restore normal operational state within to minimize the time. Um, so it's not necessarily business operations focused; it's technically focused. But the two work together. So there's an overlap between, what we think of mainly because business continuity, businesses use information technology so much. There is a distinct interrelationship between the two. So the BCP process is, use a number of activities we're doing. Number one is we want to assess the impact of a potential disaster in terms of what is the disruption and what is the loss. So we talk about data loss, but also operational loss. Basically, how much money are we losing? So there's a measurement. One of the concepts we see with BCP is the idea of trying to establish some sort of measurement of how much things are costing us. You want to formulate the appropriate plans to ensure the continuous availability of critical systems, and then really from an ongoing basis, planning, testing, evaluation, your ability to respond. So the idea is you create a plan, and then you test the plan, and you evaluate, and you improve your capabilities. All right. So it's not a case of okay, we develop a plan, we throw it in the bottom drawer, and just wait for something to happen. It's really it's a very there's very active measures that take place around continuity planning, disaster recovery planning, or, over the course of a year. Initiation. So this is really the whole idea of the project initiation is really to get support from senior management. Ultimately, this is a business impact. This is a business thing. So basically, the people, um, at the top, the leadership of the organization need to be the ones who are engaged in this and actually be able to drive, understand the importance of it and drive it. So you have to focus a lot of the effort that gets done with these planning activities, or you need to convince management of the risks associated with not having a viable plan and whether the associated benefits. In addition, you really want to you treat this as a regular project. So traditionally, you develop a project scope, project timeline, organizational policy for implementing this. So when talking to the executives, the senior folks, the types of things where you want to communicate, or you put things in terms of financial, the risk from a risk perspective. What are the financial risks? What's the cost of implementing the plans measured against what is the magnitude of the potential financial loss? You Ideally, the cost of recovery should not be more than the cost of the disaster. So obviously, if that's the case, then you don't worry about it. But in most cases, the cost of the disaster is usually greater than the cost of the recovery. Um, In addition, all the things to look at regulatory. There's a requirements. A lot of organizations require, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, around are required that a organization have a um, recovery plan, established, developed. And finally, regulatory, reputational. The idea of, if there's a organization was to have an event occur and was disrupt operations, it would be basically the idea, the impact of on the brand, loss of faith, impact on customers, things of that nature. So a timeline. So this takes a while. So this is not necessarily something you do in a weekend or in the course of a week. There's actually a number of different things. So this can take anywhere from like 9, 10, 12 months to to pull all this stuff together, put a plan together of doing evaluation testing and be able to move forward on it. So the idea is, first step is you create a notification. Who are the people who in the organization? What is their contact information? How do you manage it? How do you maintain it? Um, identify and back up vital records within, say, about 6 months. In addition, within that same time frame, you want to also be able to create a business impact analysis. If we lose these systems, if we lose this capability, if we cannot run these processes, what is the impact? What should we recover first? What should we recover second? What should we recover third? The overall organization strategy is probably within that time, maybe 6, maybe 9 months, something like that. Also within this, an alternative site. Usually, what will happen is continuity plans. Or one of the things around the continuity plans is that, okay, the recovery is actually you're going to restore operations at a different site. If you're, say, for example, your operation burnt to the ground, obviously you're going to have to put it in, stand this thing up in an alternative location. All right, so developing a plan around that, defining the site, building the dynamics around that. Probably anywhere from 9 months to a year. Would you ideally like to have your contingency planning in place by the end of the first year, and that would include the plans for testing, maintaining, and auditing. And then on an ongoing basis, establishing a timeline to test this stuff on an ongoing basis and report back on the results. So there's a bunch of different types of planning considerations around networking and RAID, which is around deals with data storage and network redundancies and data backups and regulation, legal standards, organizational risks. One of the outcomes of the attacks in 2001 in New York was there was the 9/11 Commission had a series of recommendations, in how to recover from disasters, by comparing the business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans to the National Fire Protection Association. It was one of the learnings that came out of 9/11, because that was kind of a, clearly a worst case event that had occurred. Not every disaster is of the scale of a 9/11, but there are, other situations, other scenarios which could have, a large impact on companies. A couple things around that. There's some of the guidelines that came in there, practice areas around this. The NFPA 1600 as they called it. Project initiation management, risk evaluation, business impact analysis, continuity strategies. Things like emergency response, the development and implementation of a business continuity plan, awareness programs. Very important, maintaining and exercising the plan. That's one of the things that most organizations will have, will schedule and execute on an annual basis, carving times out. Public relations and crisis communication, which is actually sometimes it's overlooked as a critical item, but that is something that, depending upon the circumstances, is of vital importance in dealing with a disaster and a disruption. How do you communicate what is happening? Frequency of communication, modes of communication, and finally, coordination with public authorities. Because a lot of these things are not necessarily limited. The scope of activities or events are not limited to just simply maybe within the four walls of the organization. Could have, broader impacts within communities. So public authorities are will be engaged, could potentially be engaged as well. Legal concerns, one of the big situations that organizations are always worried about, liabilities of the organization of the company, liability of the corporation and the executives, liability of the organization, outside parties. There's a lot of contractual requirements. Um, there's also standards of what we call negligence and care. And being able to establish a due diligence around this. The legal term that gets used, that gets applied in a lot of these cases, is what we call the prudent main rule. It states that each person has a duty to behave as a reasonable person would be expected to under the same or similar circumstances. If organization does not meet that rule, then they are subject to be potentially sued by stakeholders who are involved. So, part of the stuff that comes into this would be, evaluation of what is the probability. If you do not have a business continuity plan, do not have a disaster recovery plan, obviously you would probably be held liable under a prudent man rule, because a best practice would be to establish those types of programs and have those types of plans in place. Financial institutions have, particular focus, obviously, in different areas, both due to the regulatory and the impact of kind of who their stakeholders are and kind of what they do. New York Stock Exchange, which is here Rule 446, they must have a written business continuity plan and conduct yearly reviews of the plans. A couple other ones here. Sarbanes-Oxley, which came out in early 2000s, actually is a part of that, deals with um, you know establishing, developing, testing, and documenting continuity and recovery plans on an ongoing basis, particularly for organizations dealing with financial impacts. Required resources. I mean, there's a lot of effort that goes into this stuff. It is not a cheap exercise. It is not a trivial exercise by any means. So there's a whole the idea of identifying people who will be involved in the planning process, be involved in the testing process, and then kind of disaster recovery plans in large part involve the engagement of virtually everybody in the organization, from the executive level down through the folks on the shop floor. Um, both through the testing and then evaluation as well, because the idea would be, with any sort of engagement, any sort of testing, the results of that would be evaluated and potentially modifications made to improve the process for the next time through. Right? So a lot of this stuff is, you identify what the resources are going to be, and the documents be created all throughout the planning process, and those become living documents that get reviewed on an ongoing basis. So some of the stuff we've got here, a contact list. We talked about the contact list a little bit, but the idea of having, it seems kind of trivial, but it's always interesting. And in the case of an emergency, knowing where everybody's at and being able to contact them is critical. Identification of vital records. What are those? Where should they be maintained? How are they maintained? Documenting what they are. We talked about the impact analysis. What are the processes that we run? What do we need to do to maintain them? What is the potential impact in case of a disruption? Stated in the form of, say, loss per hour. And in a comprehensive strategy. Alternative sites. We talked about, where do you, assuming that your one organization, one operation is destroyed, what do you recover to? Where do you recover at? Project plan. All the information that is pulled together is is documented in the form of a project plan. The idea is, you do not want to be in a situation where you have a disaster and you have to improv or make things up as you go along. The idea is, you go to the plan and you execute as the plan has laid out. And then testing, maintenance, and upgrading of these different strategies that we've got out here. There's a bunch of legal, there are critical legal records, that you'd want to have. You want to make sure that would be uh, maintained outside of the organization in a protected state. So these are all sorts of, legal documents, correspondence with customers, contracts, proposals, letters of incorporation, and deeds, everything that you need from a legal perspective that you'd want to maintain. And in addition, vital business records. So this is actually a little bit more from an operational perspective. Obviously, the plan itself is something you'd want to. The disaster recovery and business continuity plans. A lot of times, what organizations will do, they will designate, somebody in the, in the executive to be able to maintain, to hold a copy of them, maintain a copy of them with them. So in case there was a disaster, there's, be assured there's always going to be a copy of the plan around somewhere. Procedure, procedure manuals, backup files, application, reference documents, basically everything you need to bring things back together. So the idea is, as you're running backups, as you're maintaining and store, as you're creating all of your documentation associated with all your applications, you've got that's maintained at a site that, in case of a disaster, you could go back and pull that information back. So that includes backups of all of your systems that you would be using as the starting point for your recovery. We've talked about the BIA, a management level analysis of organizational systems, processes, and interdependencies. It's really its goal is to determine the impact, and then based upon that impact, to put a plan together of what gets recovered first, second, third, fourth. One of the issues a lot of times you run into is, everybody has the expectation that, okay, when you start a recovery process, that everybody's first, and the reality is not everybody should be first. Some things are definitely clearly going to be more highly prioritized than others. So that's where kind of what you map out in the business impact analysis plan. The goals, as we say here, prioritize systems in terms of criticality, define maximum acceptable downtimes, and determine the resource requirements. What do you need to bring everything back and make things operational? And that really covers everything we need to know about our business continuity, business impact analysis, and disaster recovery planning.